Hello and welcome to the turbulent world with me, James M. Dorsey, as your host. U.S. and Israeli responses to President Bashar al-Assad's fall offer a masterclass on how to discourage change in Syria. Rather than test and encourage Syria's new leader, Ahmed al-Sharaa, also known as Abu Mohammed al-Jawlani, U.S. and Israeli actions seem designed to box him in and potentially set him up for failure. Mr. al-Sharaa is no run-of-the-mill rebel. He is a former al-Qaeda and Islamic State operative with a $10 million U.S. bounty on his head. A deeply religious figure, Mr. al-Sharaa insists he disavowed jihadism when he split with the jihadist militants in 2016. His track record since then has been checkered, but suggests his claim has merit, even though question marks remain. US and United Nations officials have noted that Mr. al-Sharaa has said all the right things regarding inclusivity, minority rights, Iran, Hezbollah, and transitional justice, but want to see actions follow words. Setting a date for elections and laying out how Syria will go about drafting and approving a new constitution in line with United Nations Security Council Resolution 2254 would go some way in that direction. Adopted in 2015, the resolution provides a roadmap for political transition in Syria. Mr. al-Sharaa argued this week that Syria was not ready for elections because it was still mired in turmoil, with millions of Syrians internally displaced or in exile. Instead, the Syrian leader and other Hayat Tahrir al-Sham officials have spoken about the need for a technocratic government that would reform institutions. Even so, Mr. al-Sharaa's statements to date and initial administrative moves were enough for U.S. officials to enter into direct contact with Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, despite it being a U.S. designated terrorist group. It was also enough to spark debate in Washington on whether to take the group off the U.S. terrorism list. However, it was not enough for the U.S. Congress to lift the harshest sanctions imposed on Syria, one of the world's most sanctioned countries, introduced initially to isolate the al-Assad regime. Instead, Congress extended the sanctions, which would have expired on December 20, hours before the rebels overthrew Mr. al-Assad. The Congress vote puts the ball in outgoing U.S. President Joe Biden's court. Mr. Biden has the authority to waive many of the sanctions. Congressman Joe Wilson, a South Carolina Republican, and Pennsylvania Democrat Brendan Boyle urged the Biden administration to suspend sectoral sanctions and sanctions related to reconstruction, while maintaining sanctions on former al-Assad regime officials. Messrs. Wilson and Boyle argued a deliberate and phased approach is required to unwind sanctions and export controls against Syria. Lifting the sanctions would be a gesture that allows Mr. al-Sharaa to move ahead with the rebuilding and rehabilitation of what Syria's newly appointed information minister, Mohammed al-Omar, described on Al Jazeera as a war-ravaged, completely destroyed economy that needs to be rebuilt from scratch. Even so, saying the right things also failed to persuade the United States to pressure Israel to limit its massive bombing campaign. The intensity of the campaign suggests Israel's goals go far beyond depriving post-Assad Syria of whatever weapons of mass destruction, particularly chemical weapons, it may have inherited from the deposed president. Rather than pursuing objectives targeting precise Israeli security concerns, such as ensuring Syria no longer serves as a conduit for weapons and funding to Hezbollah, the Iran-backed Lebanese Shiite militia, and Palestinian insurgents in the occupied West Bank, Israel appears determined to militarily emasculate the new Syria. The Israeli military said it had destroyed 80% of its Syrian counterpart in hundreds of sorties in the past week, in what one security official described as one of the largest attack operations in the history of the Israeli Air Force. Classified al-Assad regime documents leaked on social media after the president's toppling suggest that Israeli targets included in past years to ensure the Syrian military had what it needed to keep a weakened Mr. al-Assad in power. In other words, Israel did not want to emasculate Mr. al-Assad in the way it is emasculating Mr. al-Sharaa. The problem is, emasculation is hardly a way to make friends, particularly if Israel and Mr. al-Sharaa's new Syrian administration, more likely than not, have a common interest in addressing Israeli security concerns as they relate to Iran and its non-state allies, who were, together with Russia, Mr. al-Assad's principal backers. Israeli Defense Minister Israel Katz asserted that unspecified recent developments in Syria are increasing the intensity of the threat, despite the moderate appearance that the rebel leaders claim to present. Meanwhile, Israeli officials said Jordan was acting as a communication channel between Israel and Hayat Tahrir. The communications focused in part on preventing Iran-backed groups from smuggling weapons via Jordan to Palestinian militants in the occupied West Bank. Israel's failure to pursue less destructive ways of addressing its concerns amounts to a refusal to pick up on Mr. al-Sharaa's initial messages, including statements that Syria is war-weary, does not want a conflict with Israel, and has ended Iran's use of Syria as a funnel for weapons and other supplies to Hezbollah and others. In that vein, former Israeli Foreign Ministry Director General Alon Leal noted that Israeli officials refused to acknowledge the significance of Mr. al-Sharaa and his rebel group, referencing Israel by its name, as opposed to the al-Assad's regime's labeling of the Jewish state as the enemy or the Zionist entity. Israel also failed to note that Mr. al-Sharaa, in stunning remarks for a Syrian leader, justified Israel's targeting of Iranian and Hezbollah facilities in Syria during Mr. al-Assad's reign, arguing that the rebel takeover had eliminated the Iranian threat. Emasculating Syria militarily, coupled with Israel's planned expansion of settlements in the Golan Heights, suggests Israel realizes that its US-backed 1981 annexation of the territory conquered from Syria during the 1967 Middle East War precludes the possibility of a normalization of relations between the two countries. So does Israel's occupation of additional Syrian territory, including areas operated by rebel groups supported by Israel during the civil war. Areas occupied by Israel since Mr. al-Assad's fall include territory in the Quneitra Governorate and the Yarmouk Basin in Deraa, close to the Golan Heights and the Jordanian border. Israeli military correspondents reported that local officials were collecting weapons in their villages and handing them to Israeli forces. That does not by definition mean that locals welcome the Israeli presence. Based on recent interviews with locals, scholar and analyst Ayman Jawad al-Tamimi warned that Israeli operations were erasing goodwill Israel had garnered during the civil war, when it enabled them to create a buffer zone to keep Iranian and Hezbollah operatives away from the Golan Heights and provided medical services. All in all, Israeli troops reportedly advanced 10 kilometers from the Golan Heights further into Syria and are at Hadar, 20 kilometers from Damascus. In a statement, the region's religious leaders insisted Hadar, like the other villages on the Golan, is an integral part of Syria, and we have no desire to be annexed to Israel. Israel has a history of failing to turn military victories into political successes. Syria threatens to confirm the rule. Similarly, the Biden administration's refusal to rein in Israel amounts to a self-defeating attempt to bite off the nose to spite the face. With Middle Eastern states condemning Israeli operations in Syria and calling for support of Mr. al-Shara's government, U.S. backing for Israeli actions in Syria, and maintenance of sanctions risks destabilizing rather than stabilizing the country and the region. Destabilization could potentially involve Syria's fragmentation, with Kurds in the north seeking to carve out an autonomous existence of their own, despite recent advances by Turkish-backed forces, and Alawites, the Shiite Muslim sect from which the al-Assads hail, following a similar course, with possible Russian and Iranian support. That could hardly be the purpose of the exercise. Thank you for joining me today. Thousands across the globe are avid readers and listeners of the turbulent world. Join them in helping maintain and expand the column and podcast by becoming a paid subscriber. Paid subscribers have access to the full archive, exclusive posts, and polling, can leave comments, join debates, and know they are supporting independent writing, reporting, and analysis that lets the chips fall where they fall. You can contribute by going to jamesmdorsey.substack.com and choosing one of the subscription options. Thank you for your support and loyalty. Take care and best wishes.